Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Storytelling Brain. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. Next slide, please. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. When you join today's...
Slide.
When you join today's presentation using your computer speaker system by default, and if you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select phone call in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions pane, and we will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. If you would like to use the hand-raising tool for the opportunity to ask your question live, the session organizer will announce your name and let you know you've been unmuted to ask your question. I would now like to introduce the session moderator, Mary Patricia Kent.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you today at our 8th annual Midwest Damage Prevention Training Conference, but first ever virtual. I would like to let you know that tomorrow, Friday, you will receive a survey about all of today's webinars, and we would really appreciate it if you would complete that and provide your feedback. We will also share an email in the coming weeks that gives you access to recordings of all the presentations from today. As Kat mentioned, please submit questions using the questions panel on your screen. It is now my pleasure to introduce the speaker for this session, John Bricks. Prior to getting involved in the oil and gas industry, John Bricks was a police officer for a major metropolitan city for over 13 years. During his time as a police officer, John was involved in the services training department and trained over 600 recruits. John developed an innovative and progressive set of instructional philosophies that is customized to the oil and gas, safety, and construction industries. And I'd also like to mention that John was our highest rated speaker at last year's Midwest Damage Prevention Training Conference, and we're very delighted in welcoming him again this year. So with that, I'll give it to John.
Thank you very much, Mary Patricia. Next slide. So there's a part of our brain that for long-term memory storage works a lot better if we take language out of it. And if anyone ever has a problem remembering somebody's name, the best way to do is to memory tag them. So my name is John Bricks, and this is the memory tag I use when I present. Next slide. And the reason why I use that item, I'm a big guy, and it is very, very easy for people to remember my last name when they memory tag me to that structure, which is a brick shit house. So because I'm such a big guy, immediately that's a really good memory tag to use. Next slide. With that memory tag is a huge opportunity, again, to remember my first name. Next slide. Because if we open up that door, what's inside? There's a John. So by memory tagging my name with that structure, in the future, you'll be really, really successful remembering what my name is, and it's very, very easy to recall. So if you have a hard time remembering people's names, the best way to do it is give them a nickname or memory tag an image to their name. Next slide. With this tool that I just delivered, we're actually going to look at how it works also to manage stress. But today, we're going to be going quite in depth about stress. And I think stress in this present climate is a huge, huge thing. We need to learn how to mitigate it and manage it better. Next slide. With the idea that we know already how to manage stress, we know that exercise, eating right, getting enough sleep are all excellent pathways forward to manage stress. Next slide. One thing that people are lacking, though, is to understand how the mind works under stress. And what we really need to do is look at how the brain is structured. So we have the neocortex, the limbic system, and the reptilian complex. Next slide. What I'm going to do is give these basic parts of the brain different terminology so they're really easier to remember in the future. So the neocortex is a conscious mind. And it's theorized that this part of our brain is the newest development in our evolution. So the conscious mind is really, really good at language, arts, mathematics, creativity. That part of the mind is theorized that it was developed when we started to communicate through language and we started to share information and be very, very creative with mathematics and engineering. So that part of the brain grew dramatically. Next slide. The older part of the brain is what we call the limbic system or the subconscious mind. And really the limbic system or subconscious mind is our librarian. And what is really cool about this part of the brain, it's roughly about 80% of your brain mass, and it does store everything from birth to death. So everybody has technically a photographic memory. The interesting thing about the subconscious mind is it dislikes language because it didn't evolve with language. It evolved with sight, sound, smells, and emotions. Language is the part of the conscious mind's program. The understanding about how the subconscious mind stores information is key to our success moving forward. And what's really cool is the longevity of the data, if we want to call it that, that is stored to the point that we can have an experience. So let's use the analogy of you smell baking bread and it brings you back to your childhood. So the odor of the bread is olfactory. It's a very powerful memory stimulant, and it will bring you right back to the experience as a child, sight, sound, smells, and emotions all combined, no matter how much time has passed. Next slide. And what we're seeing now is the reptilian complex. And the reptilian complex is the oldest part of the brain. And really that part of the brain is there to manage all of our autonomic systems. So hormones, breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, all these chemical responses that the body does, that is the role of the reptilian complex. Next slide. The interesting thing about all of these aspects is they actually have a hard time communicating to each other. So the way I like to look at the human brain is a computer. And as updates are generated and the computer has grown in complexity, the 5.0 program has a really hard time communicating with the 1.0 program because the 1.0 program is just very, very old and doesn't understand this new information. And a really good way for everyone to understand this is I'm going to give a very brief verbal command, so the language, which will be the conscious mind. You have to pay attention to the image that pops up in your mind's eye. And what that mind's eye is your subconscious mind. So I'm going to give a very clear verbal instruction. You just pay attention to what pops up. Next slide. So the instruction is, don't think of a pink elephant. Next slide. What happens in our subconscious mind is we think of a pink elephant, even though the verbal command was to not think of a pink elephant. We could have thought of an orange. We could have thought of a peanut, an orange peanut. It doesn't matter. The subconscious mind has a hard time with language and actually will remove the word don't from our instruction. So next slide. And this goes to everything in our environment. Whenever I post this, everybody reads the bottom line. And the reason why is because the subconscious mind dislikes the word don't or do not. And that's just a very low-level example about how all these different programs have a hard time working with each other. Next slide. As we start to talk about stress, what's really important to understand is the aspect of visualization. And what visualization is that mind's eye. It's your subconscious mind storing information. And visualization is very, very powerful because if you visualize success, your chance of success increases dramatically. So in sports and all the professional industries, visualization was around and is still around, where athletes will visualize their fight, their driving, their skiing, whatever. Next slide. And the easiest way to understand this is that if I had this board on the ground, let's say it's 12 feet long, 12 inches wide, and I put it on the floor and I ask people to walk across this board. Everyone can do it. There's no problem. Next slide. Now I take this very same board and place it between two buildings, a couple hundred feet off the ground. What happens? Well, the visualization process changes. And a lot of people will see that and visualize falling. And then your chance of failing increases dramatically, even though the structure you're walking across has not changed. The only thing that's changed is the height off the ground in your visualization process. So what we visualize is very, very important. Next slide. Now that we've really gone over a high-level view, we can understand that inside the human brain, there's several different programs. So we talked about the conscious mind, the subconscious mind. Now, next slide, we're actually going to be discussing a very different program inside the human mind, and it's called the rumination brain. From going forward, it'll either be called rumination or what I prefer, the storytelling brain, because the storytelling brain really allows us to understand what this program in the mind is used for and what it's really about. Next slide. What we need to understand is that the rumination or the storytelling brain is directly linked to our stress. Next slide. And of course, moving forward, we'll have to get a baseline on what stress is so we're all on the same page. So stress is a mental or emotional strain or tension resulting from adverse or very demanding circumstances. So that is the stress that we're going to be talking about today. Next slide. When we are under stress, the body releases a chemical cocktail, adrenaline, epinephrine, and cortisol. Adrenaline and epinephrine are high-level stimulants. Cortisol is what we will be talking about in depth during this presentation, and the cortisol's role is to shut down non-essential processes in the body to ensure survival. When we get an adrenaline dump, what a lot of people would call it, we get dry mouth, shallow breathing, urge to go to the bathroom, upset stomach, heart rate palpitations. All these things are occurring mainly because of the stimulants that are now entering the body, as well as the effects of cortisol. Next slide. And if anyone really wants to understand the effects of an adrenaline dump, most people, you get them to present or speak in front of people, and you will see all these actions. You'll see sweating, you'll see shallow breathing. These are all normal stress responses. We evolved to have 24 hours of these chemicals, adrenaline and epinephrine, inside the body. So we evolved for 24 hours of continual stress. That's what our evolution made us. And if you think about it, that's pretty remarkable, because as this picture depicts, as a caveman, our stress would have been very short and precise for a very limited amount of time. Either we got away from the woolly mammoth or the woolly mammoth got us and we died. So to have 24 hours of these chemicals stored is actually quite phenomenal. Next slide. When we need to understand, the moment we go over those 24 hours, we start to suffer from long-term stress. And there's some very indicative human physiological reactions when we are under this level of stress for a long period of time. Next slide. What is attributed to long-term stress is hair loss. Next slide. Undiagnosed muscular pain. This is a big one for a lot of people. So there is muscular pain occurring in a person's body, but there's no method of injury. So there's no prior injury or anything like that. A lot of people that will suffer from long-term stress, you can tell, they tell you, well, I feel it in my shoulders or my neck hurts. You can tell if somebody's stressed out for a long time because they'll start wrenching their neck. These are all aspects. So for a lot of people, the idea of undiagnosed muscular pain is linked to long-term stress, which is actually linked to cortisol, which we will find out as we go along. Next slide. So for a lot of large medical institutions like the Mayo Clinic is now actually starting to study cortisol with all these different ailments that I'm going to go through. The other thing that elevated levels of cortisol or long-term stress will do is cortisol's role, like I said, is to stop all non-essential processes in the body. And one of those non-essential processes is digestion. It is a fight or flight scenario. So the cortisol will shut your digestion down. That's why a lot of people feel an upset stomach when they're under a lot of stress. And it's simply that mind-gut connection where cortisol is put into your system and digestion starts to fail or slow because it's not important. So what's really common is stomach ulcers, gastritis, irritable colon, next slide, decreased muscle growth and decreased organ growth. And that is occurring because you're not digesting your food properly. Psychologically, or with the actual mental process, there's some very key factors to long-term stress: insomnia, irritability, anxiety, depression, decreased learning potential, and decreased memory loss, and decreased intelligence. Now, if you're caught in this cycle, think about what it does for your stress levels. You have a hard time sleeping, you're irritable, you go to work, you're anxious, you feel depressed, you don't function as well, work pressure increases, stress increases, you go home, and with the irritability, anxiety, and depression, your home life attributes more and more stress. So it's a very, very vicious pattern, next slide, that a lot of people are caught in presently, and that is the effects from long-term stress. Eczema and psoriasis, increased sensitivity to pain, next slide, are all aspects to elevated cortisol levels. And because a lot of people, when they're under stress, get dry mouth, a lot of times mouth ulcers and excessive dryness of the mouth is also a sign of long-term stress. Next slide. And all of these things, of course, lead into the heart. And everyone knows elevated stress, long-term stress, is hard on your cardiovascular system. So cardiovascular disease, hypertension, increased heart rate, and increased blood pressure, next slide, are all effects of elevated cortisol levels. And what's really interesting, it can actually exuberate asthmatic conditions inside the lungs. And it also makes sense because cortisol's other role is to suppress our immune system, because our immune system at that time is not important. So cortisol will tell the reptilian complex, hey, we are about to die, or we are in a high stress situation. Our immune system and your management of the immune system is not important right now. Shut it down, because we need to deal with other things, and we can start it back up when we start feeling less stressed. Next slide. So the long-term effects of stress are all linked to the storytelling brain, because there's truly no such thing in our environment as long-term stress. We aren't in a situation where we are continually affected by long-term stress. We're not continually being chased by bears or woolly mammoths or anything like that. So it's all linked to the storytelling brain. Next slide. And what we're going to do now is, because we understand that the storytelling brain creates long-term stress, what we need to do is understand, next slide, why we would have something, a program that is really out there to be your worst friend ever. And the storytelling brain's program or design is to look at our environment and perceive potential threats. And next slide. Many people would then just be asked, well, why do we have a storytelling brain? Why would we need a program that would search our environment for potential stress? Next slide. And it's actually a very successful evolutionary program. So if there's two cave people and they're standing outside of this cave, and one of them has the start of a storytelling brain and the other one has no storytelling brain program, they'll both want to go inside the cave. They'll look at it, they'll be like, well, you know what, it's dry, it's out of the elements, it looks quite protected, and it even looks like there might be a source of water inside the cave. Next slide. But what would happen is the one with the storytelling brain would be like, I should be a little bit cautious entering that cave because there could be a bear. So that program started to work at forecasting what the threat might be. And of course, if we think about it, the one with the initial storytelling brain program would live longer. Living longer would mean more offspring. Out of all of those offsprings, the ones with a better storytelling brain would also live longer and have more offspring, and so on and so on and so on. So the evolutionary cycle would continue. And it, like I said, in the beginning, the storytelling brain was actually very, very effective at ensuring that we survive. Next slide. What is being realized, though, is that humans are the only species that suffer from long-term stress. Humans are the only species that will try to forecast potential dangers. The mouse in this picture is not worrying about winter. The mouse simply eats what it needs to eat. Next slide. And then will store some food for reserves. If there's any hunters out there, every hunter would be, hey, this buck really needs to worry about hunting season. But it doesn't. It lacks a storytelling brain. It does not spend all the other seasons, summertime, worrying that fall's company because of the fact that there's going to be a high-level apex predator out there to get it. It suffers no long-term stress. Imagine what it would be like as our species if we knew every year for a short window, for 30 days, a more advanced species would come to hunt us. That would be our complete focus of our entire society. Whereas with the deer, they lack the rumination brain. They lack that ability to be stressed for long term. Next slide. But what we need to do then is work and differentiate the difference between real stress and false stress. Real stress is things we can manage and deal with. False stress is your rumination brain working. Next slide. And a great example is, once again, a bear. If we're getting attacked by a bear, that is real stress. We are going to function the best we ever did in our life. The body's going to dump adrenaline, epinephrine, and cortisol into our system. We will function the best. Our heart rate will go up. We'll be the strongest and fastest we've ever been for a very short amount of time to survive this bear attack. Next slide. So the bear attack is real, and we are predisposed to survive that encounter. Same thing as getting mugged. Getting mugged, real stress. We're going to experience all the physiological effects of the chemical systems that we evolved with so that we could manage this successfully. And like I said, you will function the best you've ever functioned in your life. Next slide. The only time we do not function well is when it's false stress. Next slide. And what is really interesting, and I think the reason why our stress levels are increasing with technology is because media loves our storytelling brain. At the end of the day, the media knows, everyone's like, well, why is there no good news? To be honest with you, we don't have a good news program. We don't share good news. We do, however, have a storytelling brain program. So we will share bad news. And that's why the media continually puts bad news into our feed. And because technology has increased to the point now where we can get information anytime, anywhere, anyhow, and information that is directly designed for what we're looking for, it increases our stress level. Next slide. And you can actually see how the media knows that fear is contagious. So even if you look at this slide, decade after decade, there is a new fear on the horizon. And it's changed all the way from communism in the 1940s to the nuclear threat in the 1960s, to acid rain in the 1980s, and so on and so on and so on. And what's really interesting, if we look back in time, we can actually prove that those stresses were false stress because it really never happened. But yet everybody's stressed out about it. Next slide. So a great example of a fairly recent false stress is Y2K. Next slide, please. And everyone can remember the Y2K aspect. And with Y2K, for those who don't remember, it was basically the turn of 1999 to the year 2000, and it started off very, very innocently, with everyone being fairly excited for the dramatic change that we're going to go through. But all it took was one person to mention, hey, I don't think the computer programs were designed for the zeros, because we've always just gone 97, 98, 99. And because we have a rumination mind and media loves fear, suddenly it came to the point of everyone needing to shut the computers off because they didn't know if the computer was going to be updated. People were talking about a grid down situation. They talked about the just on demand food supply was going to crash. And all in all, people were worried that we would go back about 10,000 years because our technology would collapse. Next slide. But what we need to remember is in the year 2000, the only thing that happened is that a lot of people woke up hungover. That whole fear-based rumination was false. Very recently, in 2012, that was really interesting to watch because social media platforms were really gathering steam. So when 2012 came out, I started to watch and monitor to see how the rumination mind and the storytelling brain would ramp people up. So what a lot of people don't understand is that 2012 is actually, next slide, a rare galactic alignment. And what happens in the year 2012 is all the planets in our solar system would go into alignment December 21st, 2012, with the dark rift in the galaxy. And it only happens every 13,000 years. So if we didn't have a rumination brain, we would need to be, as a society, be like, oh, we're very blessed because I'm here to experience a 1 in 13,000 year experience. But something interesting happened. Next slide. All it took was someone to say, hey, wait a minute, the Mayan calendar stops on December 21st, 2012. And because of that, it can't be good. What wasn't shared is the Mayan calendar is a cyclical calendar. And it just simply resets its cycle with that galactic alignment. But to watch how the storytelling brain picked up on all these media platforms was amazing because it came from something as a rare galactic alignment, next slide, to the end of the world. People were talking about pole flips. People were associating biblical references to this point in time in our history. And like I said, at the end of the day, it was coming down to the fact that the world was going to end and people were afraid. And lots of people were out there prepping supplies. It was really, really good for the consumerism side of things because everyone was out there buying flashlights, blankets, freeze-dried food, which, if it's the end of the world, all that stuff is really not going to help you anyway. But it was that whole idea of a fear-based media exposure. Next slide. The thing we need to understand is even it happens now, present day. So when the coronavirus was first put out there to the public, that was also really amazing to watch because of the huge run on toilet paper. And the coronavirus has nothing to do with that process in the body. It's a respiratory illness. So with this huge panic that occurred, people got very stressed out, started hoarding toilet paper, and everyone experienced an elevated cortisol level. And everyone is still experiencing an elevated cortisol level from this pandemic. Is the pandemic stressful? Yes. But we can control that level of stress that we're feeling by understanding what is real and what is not real, what is being promoted by the media to continue us logging on, or what they call clickbait, and what is really happening in our society around us. And if we're taking the proper precautions, we should then lower our stress level. So next slide. What we're going to do now is talk about why we need to control the storytelling brain. And of course, we understand by controlling the storytelling brain, we will dramatically reduce our personal stress levels. By recognizing what's real and what's false stress, we can become healthier people. What needs to be understood is, I use the term controlling the storytelling brain because I don't think we really ever want to shut it off. It's still a very valuable tool. If we're driving down the freeway and some bad weather rolls in and our rumination or storytelling brain starts to kick in to be like, I don't know what's around the corner, the visibility is really bad, I'm going to slow down. That is a classic example of a healthy storytelling brain. Even though there's not a threat, the storytelling brain is saying, you know what, situations are showing that it's kind of risky, you should slow down. You walk into a poorly lit parkade, and there's another person in the parkade, and suddenly you start experiencing a level of stress, listen to it. It's the storytelling brain is telling you that, hey, this is dangerous. We need to figure something out about it. Next slide. When I talk about visualization, that is what is key to the storytelling brain, because the subconscious mind lacks the ability to differentiate between real stress and false stress. And it's because of that visualization aspect. So if we look at the screen here, the picture on the left-hand side, which is a very calm brain, is your brain that is not ruminating, that is not storytelling. And then if we go to the second picture, moving to the right, someone comes along and says, hey, have you heard about coronavirus 2? And immediately what happens is that when we ruminate, we create mental pictures because it is an old program. It does not like language. And as it starts to ruminate, those mental pictures get worse and worse and worse. So then, as we see in the next picture, how overly stimulated the brain becomes, because in your mind's eye, you're creating pictures of what might happen. So with that, it could be as simple as, I need to protect my family because they're going to get sick. It starts there. And then we'll start ruminating about what it would feel like if our kids or our spouse got very, very sick, or if the economy got shut down again and we lost a job. It will actually start to associate the language it knows, sights, sounds, smells, but specifically emotions. And when those emotions come to play and those pictures are being played in your mind's eye, what happens is that reptilian complex kicks in, because it can't tell the difference whether this is real or whether you're visualizing this. When that reptilian complex kicks in, what will start to happen is a chemical response. So next slide. So for a stress that's not real, suddenly we have the same chemical response as our kids getting sick, our spouse getting sick, us losing our job. The chemical response is exactly the same because the rumination brain or storytelling brain lacks that ability to tell the difference. Next slide. And when I've given this presentation before, a lot of people have come forward and said, hey, my storytelling brain, I think it's good because it allows me to predict the future. Next slide. What is really interesting, though, is you're wrong. The storytelling brain is horrible at telling the future. Next slide. Because it is rarely right. Next slide. On average, it has been determined that an average person will ruminate about 15,000 thoughts a day. We will ruminate about just about everything in our environment. And then you have to ask yourself, if I ruminate 15,000 times a day, I get 15,000 micro stress responses. How many of those are right? And I could say we are rarely right on those. A lot of times we go and make plan A, plan B, plan C for something that may happen, and that thing never does happen. Next slide. But making those plans gives you the stress response. And eventually, no matter who we are, if we live in a state of hypervigilance, we're going to get sick. Our immune system is suppressed. Our digestive system is not working as it should be. We will get sick. Next slide. But to stop everyone's rumination brain here, we're going to learn some tools to prevent this. The body will recover, next slide, the moment that we give our adrenal glands a break. And the part of the recovery that's really interesting is the body can make as much cortisol as we want. It's actually a very simple amino acid chain structure. So no matter how much we ruminate, the body will always have enough cortisol to shut our immune system down, to ensure that our digestion isn't taking priority, all these type of things. Next slide. But by controlling our rumination mind, we will quickly lower our cortisol levels. And the moment that we lower those levels is the moment that our immune system starts to function properly, as well as our digestion functions properly. Those are the two main key points to lowering your cortisol levels. Even though the Mayo Clinic links cortisol, elevated cortisol levels to the top 5 killers of our species: cancer, diabetes, heart attack, stroke, and obesity, all linked to elevated cortisol levels. Next slide. So the first key tool that we're going to learn today is if you start to feel stressed, and everyone has a very unique stress response. Mine is my stomach starts to feel upset and my face feels a little flushed. That is when I know I'm starting to feel stressed. Other people will clench their jaw, other people will tighten up their shoulders, their hands will shake, their respiratory will kick up. Everyone knows what their stress response feels like. Now, when you start feeling that, the first thing you need to ask yourself is this question: is the stress real? And remember, real stress is imminent. Next slide. Real stress is not something that is far, far down the future in timeline. When we look at this picture, is this real stress? Is this guy under a threat? Absolutely. Will he have a solution to his problem in a very short amount of time? Absolutely. Either the tranquilizer is going to work or it's not going to work. It is that simple. Keeping in mind that this fellow is functioning the best he's ever functioned in his life because of the stress response that he's going through. So when you're starting to feel stress, you need to ask yourself, is this real? And you'll find out that very, very few times is that stress response real. Next slide. If you hear something, a rumor, something through the media, anything like that, and you start feeling stressed out, you have to ask yourself, do I know 100% that it is real? The idea of fact checking is very, very important, with the understanding that your computer algorithm will give you fact checks that support what you normally search for. So be very careful with that. If somebody comes up to you and says, oh, hey, did you hear that they're going to be cutting jobs at the office? You have to look at them and be like, do you know that 100%? Where did you get that information? If it is not 100%, what you have to do, next slide, is tell your brain to stop. It is that simple. So the moment we start feeling a stress response, we have to ask ourselves, is it real and do I know 100%? If it is not real or we do not know 100%, you need to have an internal dialogue and tell your rumination mind, hey, that is not real, stop it. And the cool part is that rumination part will stop. The rumination mind will stop putting you down the path of stress response. The interesting thing is it's used to ruminating over 15,000 times a day. So the moment that you tell it to stop, pay attention now to your internal dialogue, because you're going to recognize that the rumination program, the storytelling brain, will try to inject something else in there because it is just very good at what it does and you've never controlled it in the past. So you could easily be like, hey, is that real? Do we know? No, not at all. And you're like, okay, you tell your stress response, stop ruminating. They're not laying people off because I don't know 100%. You walk away and a couple seconds later, it'll be like, but hey, what about this side? What if they do lay people off? What are you going to do? you need to say, stop it. Because if it does happen, we are highly successful, adaptable species. We can deal with that. Next slide. The interesting thing is because of the rumination program, we are horrible at dealing with people. And a great example is when we're talking to someone or we're dealing with someone and something abnormal pops up, we instantly will take that as a negative thing. And we will instantly start to focus on what was wrong, what did I do wrong, and we'll go down the rumination path. So next slide. If we're dealing with people and we get a stress response of, I wonder if my boss is really happy with my performance, and instead of worrying about getting laid off or losing your role, you need to talk to your boss. If you come home and you're just like, something's off with your spouse, instead of being like, what did I do wrong, and go down the rumination path, you just need to stop and look at that person and say, hey, noticed you're a little bit off today. Is everything okay? Something you want to talk about? I guarantee you your rumination thoughts had nothing to do why that person's off. So many times I've given this presentation where people have reached out afterwards being like, yeah, I was really getting stressed out at work, and I sat down with my boss and asked if they were happy with my performance, because that's what I was stressed out about. And my boss was really even confused why I would ask. So it shows you that huge disconnect that we have because of our rumination brain. Next slide. Even for myself, I manage people, and I ensure that I control the rumination brain. That is part of a role of a good manager. So I would never walk into one of my workers' offices with a stack of paper, put that on the desk and be like, hey, look at this, and walk out. That is not me. What I would do if I'm in a rush is I would walk in and say, hey, can you review this? I got to head out. I'll get back to you in an hour. Because if I just walk in and don't behave the way I normally do and walk out, that other person's not going to look at it as, oh, that's John. He must be really in a rush today, because normally he's not like that. They'll look at it and be like, John's never acted that way before. He must be upset with me. And then as they ruminate further down the path, it simply will go to, well, I might as well pack my stuff up in the box because I'm getting fired. That's how powerful the rumination brain is. If you're a manager, a supervisor, a leader, or a mentor, I caution you to control everyone's rumination brain. A great other example is if someone's out in the field on a radio or even on a phone call or even through a text, which is a horrible way to communicate. If you're like, hey, come in my office, we need to talk. And I'm sure everyone right now is either smiling or nodding their head because they've experienced something like that. There's an immediate stress response. You will feel it right away. Why? Because the storytelling brain will convert that into a very negative thing. From the time of the message to the time that you get to the office, you will have gone down a heavy storytelling or rumination path to the point that you will be under an extreme amount of stress. And when your supervisor is like, oh, hey, I want to talk about this spreadsheet here. Can you clarify some numbers for me, or whatever your role is? Watch how you react. Everyone does the same thing. They take a deep breath and they're just like, oh, thank God it's not what I thought it was going to be. It is a vital role as a supervisor to watch how you manage people's storytelling brains. Give them 3 more seconds of your time and be clear why you want to have a discussion with them. If you're going to send a message and be like, hey, can you come to my office? I just need some clarification on numbers on the spreadsheet. Very little rumination brain. You're controlling it, you're managing it, you'll have a healthier employee, healthier workforce. If you hear people talking about rumors, clarify it to them. Educate them on how the rumination brain works. And if it's not 100%, let them know and just be like, I heard the same rumor too, but I'm not stressed out about it because I don't think it's legit. And if it is legit, I can deal with it. Next slide. If you think you can control your rumination brain, you have to understand that if you're going to control it by accepting the planning process it wants, and that's how it gets you. It comes out with something very small, very innocent. You make a plan for it, and it's like, oh, hey, did you think about this? Which is a higher threat. Did you think about this? And then you will continually make more plans. You will not win with that process. You need to tell it to stop. And the reason why you can't win against the process is because the entire process is made up. We are all making it up as we go along. So the moment that you make up one plan and you think now you're going to stop ruminating because you made a good plan, is the moment that that rumination brain will create another scenario. Those scenarios never stop. We will stay up late at night making plans, feeling stress because of the fact we're making plans for things that are not real. Next slide. And every time that we get that stress response, we have to understand that each one of those micro stress response is slowly killing us. It's shutting down our ability to heal our bodies. But by telling it to stop, you give it that reprieve. You allow the body to heal itself. Next slide. And as I stated earlier in this presentation, what was once a key tool linked to our survival, and that's why it is such a powerful program, is now killing us. The top 5 killers of our species are now linked to elevated cortisol levels. The bonus to now knowing this is the moment you manage your cortisol, manage your long-term stress by understanding that it's not real, is the moment that the body heals itself. And by understanding what is real stress and what is false stress and how to put checks and balances in place by simply recognizing your stress response and then telling it to stop and recognizing that you're probably going to have to do it several times. But the more we run through that process of telling the rumination brain, dictating to the storytelling brain that you are now in control, those ruminations dramatically decrease. And when they do happen, you pick up on it right away, you tell it to stop, and it will not keep coming back with other scenarios because you're now controlling it. You're teaching it how it should be managed properly in today's society, because our society is truly not filled with very much long-term stress anymore. Real long-term stress does not exist. What does exist is long-term stress through media and through our interactions and our ability to communicate across the world instantly. That is what's actually causing us a lot of long-term stress. Next slide. And I do love this quote. Smooth seas do not make good sailors. All of us here have experienced real stress. All of us here have gone through some very hard times in our life. None of us are from a silver spoon society. And even if we were, we would have had hardships during that time also. So what we need to do now is understand that there is real stress out there, but we need to give our bodies a break from the fake stress. We need to give our bodies a break from our storytelling brain by controlling it. And the moment that we do that, and the seas become rough and a storm comes in, our bodies will be primed to deal with it. We will have healthy adrenal glands and a low cortisol level to manage that spike. And as soon as that real stress is gone, we have the tools now to lower that cortisol level to allow our bodies to recover. And it's going to be that personal management that allows us to control our stress in what we perceive as a very stressful environment. That is the end of my presentation. Is there, next slide, please. Is there any questions?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, John. That's wonderful. I didn't want you to stop. That was so wonderful. So we are going to be answering some questions now. I know we're running a little bit long, but if you would like to stick around and ask a question, we do have a couple more minutes before our next session starts, so we can do that. Someone did ask me if they could get a copy of the presentation, and I said just check your email because we're going to be sending links to everyone next week with the way to download all of the talks. And I got a couple compliments as well. So if you would like to ask a question, you can raise your hand and then I will unmute you and you can ask John a question.
And as we're waiting here, on the screen here, there is my contact information. So if anyone wants to reach out and ask me a question, just bump me an email. Super happy to do that.
Wonderful, thank you. I think everyone's probably just deep in thought.
That is
because no one's really left, but no one's asking any questions. So.
And one thing I can parlay is that a lot of people, even for myself, as soon as I learned this, my world changed. I started to look at the information that I was digesting in a whole different light, and it changed in a remarkable way. I'm a happier person. I can deal with other things outside that a lot of people are really ramped up about, and I look at them and be like, well, if it does happen, we'll be able to manage it. So after this presentation, not only will you notice your rumination brain, you'll actually hear that dialogue, but you'll start to look at how the media delivers information to be like, oh, they're really pushing my storytelling brain to be stimulated right now. And then you can walk away from that level of stress very, very quickly.
Wonderful. And we've gotten so many compliments here. Jennifer Barber says, wonderful presentation. Doug DeBest says, great session. John did a good job with it. Very useful information. Thank you for sharing. Great presentation. Really enlightening and helpful in today's world. Okay, so I do have a couple questions. I do have one person has raised their hand. Dana Brill. I'm not sure if Dana, you are self-muted, so if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask the question. Go ahead.
Okay, I was just curious if he had any book or anything like that to purchase, because I know last year I attended the conference and that was the first time I heard him speak and was just like obsessed with the information that I was receiving.
Yeah, I don't have anything written yet. The beautiful part is I'm actually working through the process. You can go on my YouTube page. If you just do John Brick's Power of Don't, you'll find my YouTube page where I do have a lot of clips from past presentations on there. And I'm going to be updating that on a fairly regular basis. So if you just go there, subscribe, and then you'll be getting all the updated links as well as the progress with the book and everything else that'll be coming out. But thank you very much for that question.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Dana. I'm going to mute you again. Okay. And we have quite a few questions here. Gosh, we're probably not going to have time to get to all of them, but let me see. Okay. Okay, great presentation. Really enlightening and helpful in today's world. I said that one. Oh, this is a good one, John.
All right, here we go.
Yes, this is a really great one. I'm sure we're all thinking this. In managing stress, do you suggest we remove ourselves from Twitter and Facebook, etc.? That's a great one.
Yeah, I know I promoted YouTube and all that, but to be honest with you, the only social media accounts that I have is I have LinkedIn and I have YouTube. I don't have Facebook. I don't have Twitter. I don't do any of those things. And the idea is manage it properly. So example, if you're on Facebook and you have somebody that continually posts something that aggravates you, stresses you out, take those people off. At the end of the day, you want a healthy group of people around you. And if you're getting stressed out because of that, ask yourself what it's worth. And guess what? If someone's not on your Facebook page, they're still your friend. That's what people aren't understanding is to be like, hey, I don't like what you post on Facebook, so I'm going to just dial you back. but when we hang out, we have a great time, because a lot of people experience that freedom of expression, if you want to call it that, on social media platforms. And a lot of times those people aren't healthy in that environment because their rumination brain is going crazy and they need to share. Like I said, we like sharing the bad information. They need to share it with everybody. I would challenge people to at least take the app off their phone and just have it on their computer, so you have to physically log in, and that will be your telltale sign how much happier you are.
Yes, that's a great suggestion. Okay, to understand stress is the only way to overcome it. Thank you, from Ralph Downs. This is a very good one. This is probably a whole nother talk in and of itself, but maybe you can touch on it. We probably should wrap up in about 4 minutes, but what recommendations do you have for first responders, police officers, nurses, etc., that see highly stressful situations on a regular basis?
Wow, yeah, that's a whole different presentation.
Yeah, you could probably write a book just on that.
Yeah, because we do need to understand when the first responder experiences that situation, it is real stress for them, right? They're not watching it on the news or anything like that. They're physically living through that stress. The first thing I would say is there's a bad stigma behind first responders seeking counseling or professional help. And that stigma is what's destroying the health of these people. The healthiest cops I knew were the ones that got professional help, and the ones that actually had a large group of friends outside of the police service. So the biggest thing I'd recommend is understand that the stress you're experiencing is real, but when the call is done, the stress is done. You can take a breath. If you start ruminating, being like, oh, I could have done this or I should have done that, that is your rumination brain. It's taking control. It's happened. It's in the past. We can't change it. All you have to do is say, I did something, and 99% of the time we do the right thing. The 1% of the time we do the wrong thing. Well, then learn from the wrong thing and then move forward. But definitely understand that the real stress is done. If it's bothering you, you need to get some help, because otherwise we will bottle it up, and it's very, very unhealthy. I actually have a presentation that I call kintsugi, which is, it references a Japanese art form where they fix broken vases with gold. And it makes that vase, instead of being a normal vase, something priceless. So all these little micro fractures that gets experienced as a first responder, when we fix those, it makes us stronger and actually makes us quite a priceless individual. I'll look at putting that presentation up on my YouTube channel, because every time I've done it, it's been a great response, and it's helped a lot of people.
Okay, well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions. We're already about 15 minutes over, but John, I'd like to just thank you again for joining us today and giving us these thoughts. It's a very timely talk, and we really appreciate it. I think you helped a lot of people today. So if you have any other questions about the conference, you can go to the contact page on the conference website, and we will get back in touch with you. I would like to encourage all of you, if you're planning on attending any other sessions today, to please make sure you're registered. You have to register for each session individually. You can do that at midwest811conference.com. And thank you for joining us today, and hopefully we'll see you at 1 o'clock for the all-conference session, Mercedes Ramirez Johnson and her life story. So thanks again, John. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.